In 2004, Sony released its first handheld console, the PlayStation Portable. One of the most enduring handhelds in history, it would survive for more than a decade. A console with a strange and winding story. Born from a project meant to rival Tamagotchi toys, announced to universal surprise and quickly embraced by the press, which hailed it as an unstoppable machine, destined to smash sales records and revolutionize video games. Its marketing campaigns were unlike anything seen before. Some resembled works of art, with the console displayed like a museum piece. Others sparked controversy, accused of being provocative, even racist. Behind the scenes, quiet maneuvers aimed to push Nintendo into the shadows. What followed was an epic duel between the Nintendo DS and the PSP, a battle that would rage on for years and give rise to an avalanche of hardware revisions. 5 different PSP models released in just a few years, some of them leaking online before their official reveal. All of this unfolded amid roller coaster sales figures and a war of words, with sharp, sometimes brutal statements exchanged between Nintendo and Sony. This is the story of the PlayStation Portable, or how Sony tried to take down Nintendo with a futuristic device whose popularity rose and fell like a heartbeat. On January 23, 1999, Sony released a surprising project, the Pocket Station, defined by Sony as something halfway between a handheld console and a memory card for the PlayStation. This accessory functioned as a memory card for PlayStation games, but those games could only send data to it, allowing, for example, mini-games to be transferred onto the device, so players could continue part of their PlayStation experience even while away from home. The idea may sound strange, but just a few years earlier, Tamagotchi had sparked a spectacular craze in Japan, and soon after, across the rest of the world. It was a genuine cultural phenomenon, one that even managed to reach a predominantly female audience, a demographic traditional game consoles had always struggled to attract. A success this explosive inevitably opens up a market, and several companies began designing similar devices. The Pocket Station was therefore likely released, at least in part, to counter Sega and its virtual memory unit that is quite similar. It was more advanced than Tamagotchi-style devices, as it allowed games to be swapped in and out and, more importantly, enabled PlayStation developers to create their own Pocket Station-compatible content. A notable example is Final Fantasy VIII, which featured Chocobo World, a kind of mini RPG where players raise a chocobo using items that could later be transferred back into Final Fantasy VIII. The launch of the Pocket Station was an immediate success. 60,000 units sold out in just a few hours. Dozens of developers announced support for the accessory, and Sony officially confirmed plans to release the Pocket Station in North America and Europe. And then, nothing. The accessory suddenly vanished from Sony's communication. Production volumes were extremely limited, making the device difficult to find. Something strange seemed to be happening around this peculiar mini handheld console. Sony eventually announced that the Pocket Station would not be released outside Japan, offering a single explanation. The company claimed it could not manufacture enough units even for the Japanese market, making a worldwide launch impossible. An explanation that convinced no one, especially when coming from one of the most powerful electronics companies in the world, about an accessory this basic. This naturally raised suspicions. Some journalists began investigating, questioning their contacts inside Sony. That is when they learned that Sony appeared to be preparing a handheld console of its own. Sony itself began dropping ambiguous statements such as, "We want a slice of the Pokémon pie," strongly suggesting that a portable system was indeed in development. Electronic Gaming Monthly reported this in March 2000, also noting that Sony had recently partnered with Palm Computing, a company specializing in memory stick technology, yet another telling clue. The highly respected Japanese outlet, Nikkei Business Publications, closely tied to the Tokyo Stock Exchange Index, also reported on the existence of a handheld console in development, revealing that Sony was working on a system under the codename ET Project. But the PlayStation 2 was on the verge of release. Sony had to invest colossal sums to launch a console that was extremely expensive to manufacture. As a result, the handheld console project was quietly shelved, allowing Sony to focus all its resources on the launch of the PlayStation 2. In the spring of 2001, Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance, and its early performance was extremely strong. The console sold well everywhere it was distributed, quickly putting an end to any emerging competition. Even the Wonder Swan, which had begun to establish itself in Japan and was considering a worldwide release, suddenly found itself completely left behind by the Game Boy Advance. Once again, Nintendo seemed set to reign uncontested over the handheld console market. But toward the end of 2001, rumors began to resurface about a possible Sony handheld console. The reason was simple. Sony had started licensing ARM technology, best known for powering mobile phones, but also the Game Boy Advance itself. An ARM representative told Edge magazine that since the release of the GBA, their technology had evolved significantly, and that it was entirely possible Sony could enter the handheld console market. Months went by, rumors of a Sony handheld continued to surface, and yet nothing happened. No announcement, no patent leaks, no registered name. These rumors increasingly seemed unfounded. The frenzy surrounding handheld consoles from the late 1990s had sharply slowed down in the early 2000s, to the point that Sony officially ended production of the Pocket Station in July 2002. Then in early 2003, Nintendo announced and released the Game Boy Advance SP, which continued its hegemony, with Nintendo claiming over 90% of the handheld console market as new Pokémon games were released. But just after the release of the Game Boy Advance SP, Ken Kutaragi, the creator of the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, and president of Sony's PlayStation division, stepped onto the stage at the very end of Sony's E3 2003 conference and dropped a bomb.
There's going to be a new baby within the family. It's not a PlayStation 3. Okay. Sony Computer Entertainment will be launching new handheld entertainment platform in 2004. The name of this new platform is called PSP. Yes, PlayStation Portable. To fit PSP's small body, we created a new and small optical disc. This is a prototype of this disc. This small disc. Its name is UMD, Universal Media Disc. It has a capacity of 1.8 gigabyte, 3 times larger than CD-ROM.
Ken Kutaragi unveiled a new format, the UMD, for Universal Media Disc. These mini DVDs, he explained, would be able to store movies, music, and video games, and will be used in Sony's next console. He officially announced that Sony was working on a new handheld console, scheduled to launch at the end of 2004, just 18 months away. The list of announced features was staggering. A screen 60% larger than the Game Boy Advance, a resolution twice as high, UMD is capable of storing 1.8 gigabytes of data, 3 times more than PlayStation 1 CDs, and 60 times more than Game Boy Advance cartridges at the time. Fully polygonal 3D graphics enhanced by a wide range of graphical effects. And above all, Sony did not present it as a console, but as a multimedia device. Like the PlayStation 2, which could play DVDs, the PlayStation Portable would be able to play MP4-compatible videos, music, and fully 3D games. Ken Kutaragi summed up Sony's ambitions with a statement that left no room for doubt. Just as the PlayStation and the PlayStation 2 revolutionized the home console market, Sony aims to revolutionize and conquer the handheld console market. This will be the Walkman of the 21st century. The announcement came completely out of nowhere, and unsurprisingly, journalists were euphoric. At the time, the iPod was rapidly gaining popularity. Portable DVD players were starting to break through, as were MP3 and MP4 players. The PlayStation 2 was dominating the industry. Online gaming was becoming a major topic, and Sony had just announced a product that promised to do all of this at once. What made it even more shocking was the absence of rumors. There had been no recent leaks, no credible reports of a Sony handheld console. This was a surprise announcement, and that made the moment even more theatrical. For video game observers, it was clear a revolution was underway. Electronic Gaming Monthly wrote, for example, Nintendo's Game Boy has dominated the handheld market for more than a decade, but that could soon change. Sony has announced a challenger to the GBA, the PSP. But as enthusiasm swept through the gaming world and journalists published increasingly euphoric reactions, Shigeru Miyamoto, interviewed by EGM, expressed surprise that Sony had announced a console without presenting a model, without a prototype, with nothing more than a list of technical specifications, and a small disc. Considering Sony's size and resources, he suggested this likely meant there were problems with the console. He then reaffirmed his confidence in Nintendo's expertise in the handheld market. And Miyamoto was more right than he knew. If nothing had ever leaked about this handheld console project, it was because it was still in its infancy. Sony had just announced a console that was not even truly in development yet, far from being ready. And in doing so, the company had taken an enormous risk, because inside Sony, a brutal marathon had just begun. 18 months to create the most powerful handheld console in history. If Kutaragi went ahead with this announcement, it was because within Sony, many executives were opposed to the idea of a handheld console. This premature announcement, therefore, seems to have been a way of forcing Sony's hand. Once the project was made public, there was no longer any room for internal debate. Sony had no choice. It had to enter the handheld console war. The design of the console was entrusted to Shinichi Osagawara, a veteran of research and development at Sony Computer Entertainment. Kutaragi was clear about one thing. He wanted a console unlike any other, with a wide screen that would match movie formats. As Izumi Kawanishi, a Sony employee at the time, later recalled, the size of the PSP was determined by its large LCD screen. From the very beginning, the goal was to have a large display for content. Of course, we wanted great graphics for games, but the most important thing was allowing users to enjoy high image quality for watching movies. If the screen was too small, it would look like a phone. If it was too wide, it would look like a laptop. So we settled on a high-quality 4-inch screen, because it delivers beautiful images while remaining compact. Once the screen had been chosen, the team had no choice but to attach the UMD drive to the back of the device. Everything else had to be placed around the sides, which left very little space. Very quickly after the design process began, the team managed to secure an even larger screen. This made the console's design even more challenging, as there was now even less room to fit the remaining components. Masayu Ito remembers, "Little by little, we started placing the components like pieces of a puzzle. Whatever did not fit was rearranged, then redesigned to fill the remaining space. In the end, there was absolutely no empty space left." Sony had the advantage of being able to design a large portion of the console's components in-house, which meant they could control their size and footprint. After an intense and accelerated design process, they managed to fit everything inside the console without increasing its overall dimensions. Meanwhile, Sony held the PlayStation Meeting 2003, where it revealed the final technical specifications of the PSP in detail, and the result was staggering. Sony announced that the console would be between 10 and 15 times more powerful than a PlayStation 1. and fairly close to a PlayStation 2. They also confirmed the presence of an analog stick, wireless connectivity for both internet access and local PSP communication. A December 2004 release date was confirmed. It was madness. Edge interviewed developers present at the event, and the reactions were unanimous. Statements like this echoed throughout the room. Everyone I spoke to was blown away by the console. I did not even see how another company can compete. It is literally 10 times more powerful than everything else. It is so much more advanced. We were expecting a portable PlayStation 1, but this is basically a PlayStation 2 in your pocket. On the research and development side, however, a major problem emerged. The device failed durability tests. First, the console generated too much heat while being held in the hands, and the components were packed so tightly together that even a minor shock would propagate through the entire system. To solve this, Shinichi Osagawa decided to design a small metal plate mounted inside the console, whose role was to absorb shocks and stabilize the components. Thermal pads were also added throughout the device to dissipate heat. At last, the console began to take its final shape. But another problem arose. With so many components packed inside, the console consumed too much power. The battery technology at the time simply could not keep up. The team was therefore forced to design a UMD drive that, unlike traditional CD or DVD drives which spun continuously, would spin only to retrieve data, then stop, then spin again when more data was needed. This meant that games would have to load data in chunks, resulting in long loading times, but it was too late to change anything. The concept was finally complete. It was validated by Kutaragi and Sony's executives, and after the PlayStation Meeting 2003 and all these announcements, Nintendo was forced to react in order to slow the PSP's momentum, reminding the public that it had crushed every previous handheld competitor. Kutaragi responded in the simplest possible way by revealing 2 images of the PSP in development, one showing the front, the other the back. These images spread around the world at lightning speed, and its design immediately won everyone over. Electronic Gaming Monthly described it as the opposite of the Game Boy, with an adult high-tech look. Game Pro called it elegant, stylish, and as far removed as possible from anything that looked childish or silly. Sony also announced that it had increased the system's RAM following complaints from Japanese developers, jumping from 8 megabytes to 32 megabytes in one move. The PSP's rise in power now seemed unstoppable. But a major shadow loomed over this momentum. Famitsu managed to uncover crucial information. The PSP would not be released in 2004 in the United States or Europe. They spoke of a March 2005 release. In Japan, however, Sony was determined to release the console around December 3, 2004, to coincide with the 10th anniversary of the original PlayStation. Then on January 21, 2004, a thunderclap came from Nintendo. Satoru Iwata announced that Nintendo was developing a handheld console with 2 screens. At that moment, Nintendo finally began to be taken seriously again. The news spread rapidly and sparked widespread curiosity, and for the first time, a true duel with the PSP began to take shape. Just before E3, Sony finally made it official. The console would be delayed outside Japan. May 14, 2004 arrives. E3 2004 opens its doors. For an entire year, rumors have been swirling around the console, speculation running wild in every direction. Yet the final model remained uncertain. Sony had shown a prototype at the March Game Developers Conference, but almost no gameplay footage had been revealed. The PSP was still surrounded by a thick veil of mystery. This was Sony's moment to shine.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the latest addition to the PlayStation family. Thank you. So, what is PlayStation Portable? It is a handheld video game system that offers 3D CG games incorporating high-quality, full-motion video similar to PlayStation 2. PlayStation Portable is as revolutionary as PlayStation, but in different ways. It also has the ability to deliver high-quality movies, music, and video, as well as other forms of digital entertainment content through one central device.
Instead, the PSP's presentation was met with an unexpected wave of skepticism. The main reason was simple. Journalists were expecting a long list of games, along with plenty of screenshots and videos. 10 months had passed since the PSP's announcement, and almost no games had been shown, simply because the announcement had been premature and developers had barely begun working on the system. The console was scheduled to launch in Japan in just 6 months. Even Kaz Hirai's statements felt unclear. He defined success on the PSP primarily through extensions of existing franchises. In other words, spin-offs of PlayStation 2 games, which was hardly reassuring. On top of that, there was still no price, no concrete figures for battery life. The audience learned almost nothing. Aside from the final design of the console, worse still, the PSP segment lasted barely 20 minutes. It was not even the main highlight of the conference, as Sony chose to end its presentation by unveiling the Cell architecture, shifting the focus to the PlayStation 2's successor. But this was not necessarily disastrous. Beyond the conferences, E3 is above all a massive trade show, filled with playable games and hands-on hardware. Journalists would finally be able to test the console and its games. Still, there was almost nothing. Even worse, touching most of the PSP units on the show floor was forbidden. Many of them were there solely to play videos, most of which were technical demos or movie clips. Only a handful of PSP units were actually playable, and there were almost no games available. Alongside this, Nintendo presents the DS, and then, on its booth, there are countless DS units available for hands-on demos. Journalists can test the console, the touchscreen, the microphone, the dual screens, and above all, they can play games. Super Mario 64 DS, Mega Man, Dragon Ball Z, Metroid Prime Hunters, Animal Crossing DS, WarioWare, and many more. On top of that, Nintendo announces that the DS will launch by the end of the year not only in Japan, but also in the United States. You can feel that this is a console on the verge of release, a console that is ready. Everything the PSP is missing is right there. Journalists are won over, and in their reports, they talk far more about the DS than about the PSP. Sony has missed its chance to reassure players and journalists about the PSP as a true gaming console. However, strangely enough, the PSP still wins Best of Show, voted by American magazines and websites, an award that everyone mocks because there was virtually nothing to play on the PSP. This is where the duel between the PSP and the DS truly begins. From that point on, one is never mentioned without the other, without comparisons, without attempts to predict who will win. And it feels natural because everything sets them apart. The DS still uses cartridges. The PSP relies on the UMD format. The DS introduces a touchscreen. Sony integrates an analog joystick. The DS has 2 screens, the PSP has 1, but huge and of remarkable quality. The DS is designed purely for video games. The PSP is a multimedia machine. The DS represents innovation above all else. The PSP presents itself as a portable PlayStation 2. And for almost everyone, the outcome seems obvious. The PSP is expected to crush the DS, just as the PlayStation 2 is crushing the GameCube. At Electronic Gaming Monthly, for example, the staff believes the PSP will emerge victorious, notably thanks to its stunning design. EGM also interviews numerous developers, many of whom describe the PSP as unbeatable. GamePro conducts a poll among players, and the PSP generates more interest than the DS. Kaz Hirai appears extremely confident. He claims that the DS is merely a small evolution of the Game Boy Advance, aimed at a much younger audience, unlike the PSP. When asked whether he is concerned that the DS will launch before the PSP, he replies, "They can release it before us, after us, on the same day. It's up to them. We have seen all kinds of scenarios in the past. The Saturn launched before the PlayStation, the Nintendo 64 after. The Dreamcast launched before the PS2, the Xbox after. Whatever they want. In August 2004, the PlayStation Meeting 2004 takes place. And it is surreal. It begins with Kutaragi delivering a history of Nintendo's Game Boy, filled with praise. This is an obvious provocation and a symbolic passing of the torch, as if the PSP were meant to take over after the Game Boy era. Kutaragi is extremely confident, because unlike at E3, where it was barely possible to test the machine and Sony seemed to have shown it only after learning that Nintendo would present playable DS demos, this time there are finally PSP units available to play, with several games on display. But it's a disaster. The games are clearly not ready. Edge writes, "It is clear that PSP games are still at a very early stage of development." EGM reports that titles announced such as Twisted Metal, Medieval, and Ridge Racer feel very dated, reminiscent of PlayStation 1 games, and expresses strong disappointment. Metal Gear Acid is the most prominently featured title, but as every journalist points out, it is not a true Metal Gear Solid game, and it does not carry the same ambition. GamePro notes how astonishing this is. Just weeks before release, no one knows what the launch lineup will look like. The situation is no different at the Tokyo Game Show a few weeks later. Still no price. Still no fixed release date. Still no confirmed lineup. Still no figures on how many consoles will be available. And Sony even hired women to walk around the show holding PSP units fitted with external battery packs hidden in their hands, just to keep the devices powered throughout the event, awkwardly highlighting PSP's low battery life. EGM states that most games look like PlayStation 1 titles, and that controlling the system with the analog stick does not feel comfortable. The PSP is losing all the momentum it desperately needs before launch, and once again, Nintendo takes advantage of the situation. In October, Nintendo gathers the largest Japanese media outlets at the TFT Convention Center in Odaiba, alongside an army of DS retail representatives. Iwata speaks persuasively about the DS's potential. Miyamoto demonstrates Nintendogs. Square Enix, despite being partially owned by Sony, announces 8 DS games. Many other Japanese studios follow suit and announce DS titles as well. Iwata maintains the release date and even announces that 1 million DS units will be available at launch. The contrast is striking. Nintendo appears far more serious, far more committed to its console, far more confident. Sony, by comparison, seems hesitant. Everyone expects a PSP delay, and that the DS will have several months to build momentum on its own. Sony is in serious trouble and is finally forced to reveal everything. The release date is set for December 12th in Japan, with 200,000 units available. It seems low, but Sony finally announces a launch price, and the price changes everything. Sony reveals the PSP at 19,800 yen, roughly $170 at the time, barely more expensive than the DS. Everyone had been expecting a price of at least $350, considering the console's components and capabilities. At $170, the price is absurd. It is at least twice as cheap as the iPod, which is selling extremely well at the time. Contemporary MP4 players, like the Creative Zen Portable Media Center, are announced at around $600. Sony is losing hundreds of euros on every console sold, even after moving production to China, and publicly admits that the PSP will not become profitable for at least 2 years. And contrary to earlier statements, where Sony claimed the console would not be sold at a loss in order to lower third-party royalties and attract more games, Sony has responded to Nintendo with its favorite weapon, an aggressively low price that Nintendo cannot realistically match, not being a massive conglomerate capable of absorbing such enormous losses. Some journalists note that Nintendo appears to be repeating the same mistakes as before. The GameCube launched at a very low price to attract players. Then Sony and Microsoft slashed their prices while absorbing huge losses, leaving Nintendo with no room to maneuver. And now Sony has done it again. Even before the DS and PSP are released, only $50 separate the two systems. While the PSP offers a vast array of additional features, Edge sums it up. Last month, Nintendo had Sony cornered. The Nintendo DS price, the launch lineup, the timing, everything seemed perfect. Sony was struggling, evasive about PSP battery life, with a Christmas launch in jeopardy. And then a number, 20,000 yen, $170. No one, especially not Nintendo, was prepared for something this aggressive. Rumors had pointed to a $300 console, which seemed logical given the PSP's components. With a single announcement, Sony turned the video game world upside down. The PSP's laughable 3.5-hour battery life was suddenly forgotten. The near absence of launch games faded into the background. The lack of a bundled game no longer mattered. Everyone was simply stunned by this announcement, which suggested a triumphant arrival for the console. But in the world of video games, nothing is ever that simple. Just weeks before the console's release, several games planned for launch are delayed. It becomes increasingly clear that the PSP will have to recreate the PlayStation 2 miracle, launching a console with almost no games. But this time, beyond its price, Sony has a universal selling point: the PSP's design. It is mentioned everywhere. The same words come up again and again: a beautiful machine. Sony decides to lean fully into that strength. A massive marketing campaign rolls out across Japanese subway stations, with large images of the PSP everywhere. More strikingly, numerous consoles are put on display to be admired like works of art, surrounded by guards and accompanied by guides ready to explain the product, just like in a museum. The release date and the very low price are relentlessly hammered home, all of this in the busiest stations in Japan. A few days later, Sony installs a gigantic 8-meter-tall PSP at Tokyo Station, once again highlighting the console's design to generate buzz. At the same time, Sony airs several television commercials featuring Japanese celebrities. The company also organizes events in major cities across Japan, where people can see the console and try it for themselves. The PSP's promotional campaign is intense and compressed. In just 2 weeks, Sony unleashes a diversified marketing blitz, creating a powerful surprise effect. Normally, a console launch campaign builds gradually over 2 months. Here, everything is condensed, an attempt to exist alongside the DS, which launched just 10 days earlier and had already enjoyed a promising start. December 12, 2004 arrives. As dawn breaks over Japan, thousands of people have spent the night sleeping outside for the PSP's release. Within just a few hours, the entire stock is gone. By 10 in the morning, finding a PSP becomes nearly impossible. Then, unexpectedly at 1:30 p.m., Sony performs a surprise restock. The console briefly reappears in stores, only to vanish from shelves even faster. The launch is, on the surface, the success Sony had promised. Edge compares the PSP's release to that of the PlayStation 2, noting striking similarities. Both machines were marketed around features that had little to do with video games. Both benefited from extravagant marketing campaigns. Both sold out within hours, with people waiting all night only to go home empty-handed. And in both cases, software sales were very weak, far below expectations for the few titles available at launch. Once again, Ridge Racer arrives as a savior, just as it did for the original PlayStation, and again for the PlayStation 2. It is by far the most impressive launch title on the console. Everybody's Golf also performs decently, but all games sell well below projections. And if game sales are weak, it is because of a disaster. After the first 2 weeks, the PSP becomes nearly impossible to find. Sony had promised to deliver 500,000 consoles between launch and the end of 2004. In reality, only 240,000 units are produced, with 200,000 available at launch. The reason is simple: the PSP is difficult to manufacture, and some components are hard to source. The PSP's sales collapse, even falling behind the GameCube in Japan. Meanwhile, the DS takes off, selling 1 million units during the same period, exactly as Satoru Iwata had promised. Sony has just missed the most important sales window of the year, the Christmas season. But in January, Sony finally announces that production is resuming and increasing at the same time. Almost immediately, the PSP rebounds and even overtakes the DS in weekly sales. Week after week, PSP sales continue to climb, and the console eventually surpasses the DS in Japan, becoming the best-selling console of early 2005. Sony has managed to recover from a difficult start. Journalists around the world, having imported Japanese-launched PSP units for testing, are captivated. Edge describes the console as a magnificent jewel. The PSP, they say, is the result of exceptional power combined with exceptional beauty. Reviewers unanimously praise its stunning screen, its deep colors, and a level of clarity never before seen on a handheld console. This praise largely overshadows the console's flaws. Ergonomic issues, such as the very stiff D-pad, the hard-to-shoulder buttons, and the uncomfortable analog stick are quickly forgotten, even though developers complained so much about it that many initially refused to implement it in their games. The battery life is also very poor, offering roughly 3 times less autonomy than the DS. At the same time, Sony finally announces the American release date, set for March 24th, at a price of $250. It is significantly more expensive than in Japan, and a full $100 more than the Nintendo DS. And yet the announcement still makes an impact. Sony plans to sell the console with more generous accessory bundles than in Japan, and the first 1 million PSP units will include the movie Spider-Man 2 on UMD. Sony also announces 24 launch titles, including Metal Gear Acid, Wipeout Pure, Ridge Racer, and Lumens. Edge writes that the PSP is unstoppable. It has the design, it has the brand, and it has the price. Tsuyoshi Tanaka even states that the PSP is turning into a tidal wave in Japan, that people are buying it even if they do not care about video games, and that it is destined to eclipse the DS. Electronic Gaming Monthly agrees with Edge. They believe the PSP is going to be a massive hit. But in early February, another twist. The PSP is delayed in Europe and South Korea to an unspecified later date. A delay without a date is humiliating for European players. The reason is simple. Sales in Japan have surged too quickly. Sony is forced to redirect units originally intended for the European launch back to Japan to avoid another complete stock shortage and to prevent the DS from pulling too far ahead. On top of that, a significant number of Japanese PSP units have had to be replaced due to manufacturing defects. Just before the American release, technical comparisons between the PSP and the DS are everywhere, and the PSP completely overwhelms the DS. 17 million colors on screen compared to 260,000. 32 megabytes of RAM for the PSP, only 4 for the DS. The comparison borders on humiliation for Nintendo's console. The PSP is launching in a market even more receptive to cutting-edge technology. Sony has prepared 1 million PSP units for launch. A launch event is organized in New York, with Kaz Hirai present for the official opening of the Sony-style store, and numerous PSP units available for hands-on testing. Sony also releases several films on UMD to coincide with the launch. The next day, the PlayStation Portable launches in the United States, and the start is explosive. Thousands of players rush to buy the console. After 1 week, 600,000 units have been sold. It is a strong result, but below Sony's expectations. Still better than the American launch of the DS, which at the same time is releasing in Europe and enjoying a solid start. Sony then finally announces the PSP for Europe, priced at €250. But the release is scheduled for September, far in the future. European players are disappointed. Historically, Sony has always placed great importance on Europe, building its success by making consoles available quickly and localizing games for the European market. This time, Europeans will receive the PSP nearly a year after Japan. American journalists, meanwhile, do not hesitate to give extremely low scores to PSP launch titles, repeatedly pointing out the lack of system sellers, games capable of selling the console on their own. For the moment, the PSP dominates the DS in Japan and in the United States, exactly as everyone had predicted. The DS tries to fight back by releasing new color variations in Japan and by launching Nintendo-licensed titles such as Kirby. But the PSP consistently pulls ahead again without much effort. Then in April, a small controversy erupts in Japan. Adult films begin appearing on the UMD format. Sony is forced to explain that, unlike games, it has no control over video content released on UMD. This reveals a troubling reality. Virtually anything can be released on the format: extreme violence, adult content, and more. In 2005, this kind of revelation deeply worries parents and discourages them from buying a PSP for their children or even for teenagers. Almost at the same time, Nintendo announces an enticing wave of DS games: Mario Kart DS, New Super Mario Bros., Mario and Luigi, Castlevania, all released in quick succession. Most importantly, Nintendogs launches in Japan, and DS sales immediately surge. The following week confirms the trend, and it continues for weeks, and the Nintendo DS overtakes the PSP for the year. This momentum is reinforced by the release of a phenomenon: brain training with Dr. Kawashima. Sony responds in classic fashion, launching a major promotional campaign in Japan with the slogan, "The best is yet to come," in an attempt to counter the growing image of the PSP as a console without games. But it does not work. Weeks pass, and the gap between the DS and the PSP continues to widen, until in July, the PSP reaches its lowest weekly sales since launch, with only 19,000 units sold that week. At the same time, PSP piracy begins to emerge, with a hack that allows games to be launched directly from the memory card. This helps boost console sales, but makes selling games even more difficult. Even if the PSP performs much better in the United States and quickly catches up to the DS, Sony has to react. So at the PlayStation meeting 2005 in July, Sony changes strategy. The company shows many new games, announces new PSP colors including a white edition, and reveals an internet browser built directly into the PSP via an upcoming system update, which will also break the console's hack. Phil Harrison, vice president of PlayStation Europe, delivers a striking statement. The idea of a rivalry with Nintendo in the handheld market is ridiculous. The DS does not even appear in our forecasts. It is an unfair comparison, unfair to Nintendo, I should add. This may sound arrogant, but it is the truth. Nintendo knows its target audience very well because it has narrowed it down significantly, and it is roughly defined by the ability of a boy or a girl to admire Pokémon. Sony is confident because in August, the PSP overtakes the DS in the United States, even though the DS launched several months earlier. At E3 2005, Nintendo mostly focuses on the presentation of the Wii. And most importantly, the PSP's biggest flaw, its lack of quality games, does not prevent it from selling. EGM writes, Sony's first handheld console is off to a slower start than expected, with months of mediocre games. The DS has the edge in terms of innovation, filled with original titles and strong third-party support. This is exactly what journalists were already writing at the beginning of the PlayStation 2 era, and that did not stop the PS2 from breaking records and becoming the best-selling console of all time. Sony sees the same pattern repeating itself without concern. Above all, Sony does what Nintendo's competitors have always done: copy what works as quickly as possible. Animal Crossing is one of the most anticipated DS games. Sony highlights Fuku Fuku no Shima on PSP, which looks very similar. Brain Age is a massive hit in Japan. Sony announces a puzzle game supervised by a Japanese university professor. Later, the same thing happens with The Dog, Happy Life, inspired by Nintendogs, even though the PSP has neither a microphone nor a touchscreen. Sony counts on these titles to compete effectively with the DS in Japan, alongside the white PSP, the release of a Final Fantasy VII Advent Children on UMD. And it works. The PSP quickly rebounds and returns to the fight against the DS. The PSP is reborn in Japan. In early September, the PSP finally arrives in Europe after almost a year of waiting, priced at €250, supported by a very aggressive marketing campaign with commercials such as A Day in the Life. Sony says it is satisfied with the console's start, with stock shortages in certain countries like the United Kingdom and nearly the same situation in France. But once again, the launch games are torn apart by journalists. Many titles fail to reach average scores. And as elsewhere, the PSP's flaws are heavily criticized, especially the absurd loading times. They can reach up to 2 minutes, which is far too long for a portable console. But these issues are quickly forgotten. In October, Sony announces that it has shipped 10 million PSP units worldwide, including 4.5 million in the United States and 2.5 million in Europe in just over a month. The PSP has already nearly caught up to the DS in Europe and globally. The PSP appears unstoppable. Mediocre games, production issues, extremely poor battery life, a higher price than home consoles, none of it seems to matter. Sony was right. The DS is slowing dangerously outside Japan, and the PSP reigns supreme. Then in Japan, during the final 2 months of the year, an avalanche of DS games arrives. Animal Crossing, Tamagotchi, hugely popular in Japan, Mario Kart, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Jump Superstars, Naruto, Dragon Ball Z. The best-selling games charts are flooded with DS titles, and even Game Boy Advance games playable on the DS. DS sales break records week after week, climbing from 40,000 to 80,000 to 176,000, then 300,000, then 400,000 units in a single week. Meanwhile, PSP sales rise thanks to the end-of-year season, but remain far behind the DS. In just 3 months, the DS doubles its annual sales, finishing 2005 in Japan with 4.15 million units sold, compared to 2.2 million PSP units. Sony has fallen far behind by underestimating the impact of Nintendo's software releases. Animal Crossing ends 2005 as the best-selling game of the year in Japan, ahead of Nintendogs, Brain Age, and even Mario Kart DS. Among the 8 best-selling games of the year in Japan, 5 are DS titles. The first PSP game ranks only 40th. Fortunately for Sony, the situation is completely different elsewhere in the world. Many of these Japanese games have not yet been released outside Japan. More importantly, Sony does not repeat the same mistakes. In the United States, Sony multiplies marketing campaigns, even hiring artists to spray paint PSP advertisements in major American cities. This creates massive online buzz, as it coincides with the birth of what would later be called urban marketing. These campaigns spark controversy, which only increases visibility. And right on cue, Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories launches on PSP. The franchise that is breaking records worldwide arrives on the console. Once again, the game is criticized for its lack of originality and its spin-off nature. Strangely enough, Sony also releases the PSP Gigapack, a bundle packed with accessories, including a 1 GB memory card, enormous for the time. Coincidentally, this pack ships with an outdated system software version, making it easy to hack and allowing users to fill the massive 1 GB card with PSP games and play them for free. And again, it works. The result is astonishing. The PSP dominates the DS in North America and Europe. Over the course of 2005, the PSP sells better than the DS outside Japan. Despite launching in March in North America and September in Europe, in just 3 months it outsells the DS's 9 months in those regions. The PSP appears to be on track to crush the DS. Sony grows even more optimistic as truly strong PSP games finally begin to appear. But while Sony is busy celebrating and boasting about its sales figures, Nintendo has been holding an ace up its sleeve. The year 2006 begins with a strange event. The Nintendo DS is suddenly out of stock almost everywhere, especially in Japan. An unexplained shortage since there are no component issues, no production problems. For Sony and its PSP, it feels like a blessing, a clear path to catch up in Japan and continue dominating elsewhere. Sony tries to seize the opportunity and announces new games seemingly tailored for the Japanese market. But on January 26, 2006, Nintendo drops a bomb out of nowhere, announcing that a new version of the DS is in development, the Nintendo DS Lite. This explains the sudden shortage of the current model. The new DS will feature brighter, higher quality screens with improved color reproduction. The console is 41% smaller and 21% more compact, without reducing screen size or battery life. Buttons are redesigned and repositioned for better comfort. A new stylus is introduced, and above all, the console has a sleeker, more mature look than the original DS. Nintendo has just done what it previously did with the Game Boy Advance SP, a refined, more elegant revision. And they announce all of this casually on their website, not at a press conference, not at a trade show. But unlike the Game Boy Advance SP, which arrived 2 years into the GBA's life, the DS Lite is announced just 1 year after the DS launched. The news spread across the world, slowly but surely, and soon everyone is talking about it. The PSP fades into the background for a while. Nintendo takes advantage of the moment to announce an internet browser for the DS, released as a cartridge, as well as an accessory that allows users to watch television on the DS, echoing what the Game Boy Advance once did with video cartridges containing anime episodes. The DS diversifies, but never at the expense of games, which keeps arriving steadily. Bad news keeps piling up for Sony. Sales of UMD movies are a disaster. Sony announces that 15 million UMD movies have been distributed. Distributed does not mean sold. Large quantities remain unsold on retailer shelves. Paramount, Warner, and even Sony Pictures decide to cancel upcoming UMD movie releases. A Universal executive tells Reuters, "It's awful. Sales are almost non-existent. It's another Sony bomb like Blu-ray." The Hollywood Reporter even reports that Walmart is close to dropping UMD video entirely because no one is buying them. And then on March 2, 2006, barely 1 month after its announcement, the DS Lite launches in Japan. Sony has no time to react. The launch is insane. Thousands of people line up overnight. It looks like the launch of a brand new console, not a simple revision. Nintendo is caught off guard. They did not anticipate such demand for a product announced so discreetly just a month earlier. Only 68,000 units are available. As a result, the second best-selling console in Japan at that moment is the original DS. Both DS models sit ahead of the PSP. Nintendo cannot immediately increase production because they must continue manufacturing the original DS for markets outside Japan. In the weeks that follow, DS consoles sell for exorbitant prices before Nintendo is finally able to ramp up production and stabilize supply. Hundreds of thousands sell every single week. During this period, the DS Lite sells 10 times more units than the PSP. It launches alongside games like Tetris DS, Metroid Prime Hunters, Bomberman Land, and above all, new Super Mario Bros. DS, which starts so strong it nearly reaches 1 million copies sold in under a week in his home country alone. The DS Lite completely drowns the PSP. Week after week, the gap widens. In Japan, this is no longer a duel between the PSP and the DS. It is the uncontested reign of the DS Lite. Sony panics. The DS Lite is about to launch in Europe and North America, territories where the PSP still holds the advantage. Sony hastily organizes a surprise press conference in March 2006, the PlayStation Business Briefing. The PSP is hit with price cuts across the board, aligning it directly with the DS Lite, with new value packs at €199 and $199, and a drop to 16,800 yen in Japan. Sony floods the stage with announcements: the iToy for video and chat, downloadable PlayStation 1 games, a reduction in development kit prices, and a strong push around Monster Hunter Freedom and Daxter, now approaching 1 million copies sold. The message is clear: the PSP has everything it needs to keep dominating, but in Japan, none of it matters. Even at the same price, even with superior power and features, consumers overwhelmingly choose the DS Lite. It becomes the fastest-selling console in Japanese history. This market has slipped away from Sony. But Sony still has North America and Europe, and that is more than enough. And Sony also catches a lucky break. The DS Lite is scheduled to launch in June 2006 in North America and Europe, and just before that, E3 2006 takes place.
PlayStation 3, 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 and PlayStation 3, PlayStation 3. Let me spend a little time on PlayStation Portable, the PSP. Now on to PlayStation 3.
Sony's conference is dominated by one thing: the PlayStation 3. It is the most important project in the company's history, and it consumes nearly all attention. Fortunately for Sony, some PSP games are still announced. A real Metal Gear Solid for PSP, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, the worldwide rollout of the Platinum PSP line. Rockstar announces Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories, another GTA spin-off. Namco reveals Tekken Dark Resurrection. The PSP finally begins to show convincing games, while Nintendo is equally busy unveiling the Wii, which is nearing release. But the PSP needs far more than that. Shortly after E3, on June 11, 2006, the Nintendo DS Lite launches in the United States with new Super Mario Bros. And Brain Training. It is a tornado. 600,000 units sell in just 20 days. That is 3 times more than the PSP sells during the entire month of June. The DS's growth in North America is explosive. In Europe, the story is exactly the same. The DS overtakes the PSP, and the final 6 months of 2006 become a nightmare for Sony's handheld as Nintendo takes control of all 3 major markets. Logically, Sony launches major countermeasures for the PSP. Sony builds a large marketing campaign around Monster Hunter Freedom outside of Japan and around Loco Roco, an original game developed internally by Sony. But when Loco Roco launches in Japan, it is a failure. 30,000 copies sold in its first week is extremely weak. Then comes the real blow. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl launches in Japan and sells 1.6 million copies in its very first week. DS sales skyrocket to absurd levels. The PSP can no longer compete with the DS there. And what is worrying is that beyond the DS rivalry itself, the PSP is simply not selling well on its own. This clearly shows that despite targeting supposedly different audiences, the 2 consoles are in direct competition. Sony has to fight in Europe and North America, but they can no longer keep lowering the price of a console already sold at a loss, so they turn to their second favorite weapon: marketing. Massive television advertising campaigns are launched, including the Find Me campaign in the United States. But even the PSP's marketing derails twice. The first incident happens with an advertisement for the launch of the white PSP in Europe. The ad shows a white woman dominating a black woman and immediately sparks outrage, being interpreted as racist. Sony is forced to pull the ad quickly. Many journalists believe Sony deliberately triggered the controversy to generate buzz around the PSP, but racism is far too serious a subject for such tactics. The second incident is even more damaging. Sony launches a stealth marketing campaign called All I Want for Christmas is a PSP.
PSP, PSP, PSP. Game so crazy, they totally amaze me. Gotta ask my mom for one. For shizzy.
A blog featuring a young man named Peter rapping about wanting a PSP for Christmas. Very quickly, internet users uncover the truth. Peter is an actor paid by Sony. The blog is fake. Another scandal erupts, and Sony swiftly deletes everything related to the campaign. At the same time, Sony tries to tie the PSP to the arrival of the PlayStation 3, showing how the 2 systems can connect. But the PlayStation 3 itself launches disastrously worldwide. It was supposed to help the PSP recover, but instead becomes a burden dragging it down. Even the release of Vice City Stories once again met with lukewarm reception and later ported to the PlayStation 2, just like Liberty City Stories, fails to generate momentum. The same goes for the iconic Pro Evolution Soccer 6, whose PSP version is widely judged inferior to the excellent PS2 edition. Worse still, delays pile up. Monster Hunter Freedom 2, the sequel to the one franchise truly driving PSP sales in Japan, is delayed to 2007. The same happens with Gran Turismo and Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. And to make matters worse, the latest PSP firmware is cracked by Dark Alex and Mathuel. This further devastates game sales, precisely where Sony was supposed to recover losses from consoles sold at a deficit. Sony's financial results are catastrophic. PSP sales drop by 72% compared to the previous year over the same period, falling from 6.22 million units to just 1.76 million. 2006 has been a nightmare year for the PSP. The question everyone is asking is simple. Is it even possible to recover from such a violent reversal, especially when Sony must also deal with the disastrous launch of the PlayStation 3? But Sony has something far more concrete, and it happens at E3 2007.
And today, I'm extremely proud to make a global announcement during this presentation to introduce the world to the evolution of the PlayStation Portable. And what I'm holding in my hand is the latest version of PSP, which will become available worldwide this year in September. Now, from a distance, this PSP might not look very much different from the current model, but when you have it in your hand, the difference becomes quite clear. It's actually 33% lighter than the current PSP, and it's also 19% slimmer. And the battery is more efficient as well. And we've also made improvements to the new PSP to allow for faster loading of the games. I think the coolest feature of this new system is the ability to output high-quality video. And you can see that it's playing on the PSP right now. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press the display button. And then you can see that now what was playing on my PSP is now playing on my flat screen right behind me here.
If Nintendo managed to turn the situation around spectacularly thanks in part to a new DS model, why wouldn't Sony do the same with the PSP? Sony announces the PSP Slim and Lite. Lighter, thinner, better battery life, faster loading time. Another price cut. The new PSP will be sold at $169. An improved D-pad, and most importantly, video output, allowing the console to be displayed on a television. Nintendo had explored this idea years earlier with the Super Game Boy and the Game Boy Player. The same idea would later become central to the success of the Nintendo Switch. Here it makes even more sense given the PSP's multimedia ambitions. Perfect timing. Sony has just announced partnerships for video-on-demand services, downloadable on PC and transferable to the PSP. Sony also showcases a wave of upcoming games, announces numerous PSP bundles, introduces new colors, and confirms that the PSP Slim and Lite will launch at the same affordable price as the current model. Shortly after E3, the PSP Slim and Lite launches worldwide. In Japan, it arrives right after Monster Hunter Freedom 2 that launched a few weeks earlier, confirming the Monster Hunter craze and alongside Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. And the result is immediate. For the first time since the launch of the DS Lite, the PSP overtakes it in weekly sales. Even though the DS Lite regains the lead a few weeks later, PSP sales increase dramatically after the Slim and Lite's release. People begin talking about a true resurrection of the PSP in its home country, driven by Crisis Core. Finally, a critically acclaimed game, technically impressive, original, exactly the kind of title that sells consoles. In just 2 weeks, 580,000 PSP units are sold, an unprecedented result for the system in Japan. The same trend appears worldwide. The PSP experiences a resurgence unlike anything before. In October, sales reached 286,000 units in the United States, a 120% increase compared to the previous year. In the United Kingdom, PSP sales quadruple. Sony relaunches global marketing campaigns featuring celebrities like Michael Strahan of the New York Giants. But Sony faces a fundamental problem. The Nintendo DS has become a full-blown cultural phenomenon. It shatters records previously held by the PlayStation 2, once thought unbeatable. The DS has an astronomical year in 2007. Over 10 million units sold in the United States alone, including 2.5 million in December, 13 million units sold in Europe. Much of this is driven by Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, which launches in North America and then Europe, selling nearly 2 million copies in just 9 days in the United States. The release of the PSP Slim and Lite does not allow Sony to truly compete with the DS. Not because the Slim and Lite is a failure, but because the DS has a completely stratospheric year. At least, that is what everyone thinks at the time. But weirdly, Sony grows confident once again and announces that a revolution is coming for the PSP. Surprisingly, in Japan, the PSP overtakes the DS in the beginning of 2008, and more importantly, its sales are clearly rising compared to the same period the year before. And in March, Monster Hunter 2nd G launches in Japan. Even though it is technically just an expansion of the previous Monster Hunter, the sales are phenomenal. To give you an idea, it sells better than Super Smash Bros. Or Mario Kart Wii during the same period. And the phenomenon lasts. Months after its release, it is still the best-selling game in Japan. For the PSP, this is a godsend. A Famitsu editor writes that the PSP now dominates the DS, and that we are witnessing an unexpected reversal of the situation. And Nintendo has very little announced for 2008. Previous years were filled with an avalanche of Nintendo titles, but Nintendo appears to be focused on supporting the Wii, with Mario Kart Wii, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and Wii Fit. E3 2008 should have been Sony's chance to capitalize on this.
And through PS3, the PlayStation 3, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 3, PS3, PlayStation 3.
And once again, it is a missed opportunity. Sony announces almost nothing for the PSP at E3 2008. The conference focuses on the PlayStation 3, which is struggling to establish itself and is far more important for Sony at that moment. But a month later, at the game convention in Leipzig, Germany, a much smaller and more Europe-focused event, Sony announces a new PSP model, the PSP 3000. It is slightly thinner, features a better screen, includes a built-in microphone, and offers direct access to the PlayStation Store from the console itself. And the announcement does not go over well. Unlike Nintendo's DS revisions, which feel meaningful and evolutionary, the original PSP, the PSP Slim and Lite, and the PSP 3000 look almost identical, both visually and in terms of functionality. Sony is not losing the handheld war because the PSP is not thin enough or because it lacks a built-in microphone. Sony is losing the handheld war because the PSP lacks system sellers. And Sony seems unable to grasp this reality because it's the first time they are in this position. Historically, on PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, the biggest games were not Sony games. They were third-party titles. But when a console struggles at launch, lacks a strong installed base, and requires significant investment to develop games for, major third-party publishers tend to ignore it. In that situation, it is up to the manufacturer to step in, to create solutions, to bring high-quality games and real exclusives to the platform. Look at this. This is a Metacritic page for the best PSP games of 2008. There are only 2 games above 85. Only 9 games score above 79. That is extremely weak. Even consoles known for having very few good games, like the Wii U for example, perform far better. Look at the DS in the same year. 22 games above 79, and 7 above 85. And that is considered one of the weakest years for the DS. The PSP has developed a reputation as a console that lacks quality games and therefore lacks relevance. And as if that were not enough, in October, Satoru Iwata holds a press conference and announces the Nintendo DSi. It features an internet browser, dual cameras, SD card support, DSiWare, a digital store allowing users to download applications, small games, and extensions, and many small improvements at the cost of dropping the GBA cartridge slot. The announcement is very well received. It feels like a true evolution from the DS Lite at an affordable price. And crucially, it is announced alongside games. And then, perhaps even more threatening than the DS itself, the iPhone. The iPhone was unveiled and released in 2007, triggering a level of hysteria rarely seen for a phone. Its successor, the iPhone 3G, has just arrived, kickstarting the smartphone era. Smartphones offer almost everything the PSP offers in terms of multimedia and much more: video, music, photography, photo editing. The PSP has built its identity as a multimedia device more than a gaming console. Smartphones are seen as necessary purchases, unlike a PSP. Millions of people buy smartphones and no longer see the point of buying a PSP, especially one perceived as lacking major games. And it gets worse. In the summer of 2008, the App Store launches and opens to third-party applications. A massive wave of mobile games follows, many of them free. Titles like Super Monkey Ball from Sega are downloaded 300,000 times in their first week. This begins to directly eat into the handheld console market. The impact will become even more visible in 2009. This is precisely why Nintendo attempts to respond with the DSi, offering dual cameras and downloadable applications via DSiWare, to prevent its market share from collapsing and to allow these new types of experiences to exist on DS as well. For many of us, there is a clear difference between mobile games and console games. But for the casual players and younger audiences, the primary targets of handheld consoles, that line is far more blurred. Games like Tetris, Dr. Mario, Pokemon Pinball, Yu-Gi-Oh! Card games, Tamagotchi, these are some of the best-selling handheld games in history, and they adapt perfectly to smartphones. At that point, the only real difference between smartphones and handheld consoles is game quality. And the PSP sits at the wrong end of that comparison. Then the DSi launches in Japan and it becomes the star of the end of the year. The PSP cannot compete even with the launch of the PSP 3000. DS sales reach astronomical levels, even better than the previous year, the highest since launch, both in the United States and in Europe. The first half of 2009 seems to follow the same pattern, but there is a major change compared to previous years. A wave of PSP games is announced: Little Big Planet, Assassin's Creed, Rock Band, Persona, a new Monster Hunter, Tekken 6, and then comes E3 2009 in June. And it is an avalanche: Resident Evil, Jak and Daxter, GTA Chinatown Wars, and even Gran Turismo, announced 4 years earlier and then abandoned, is officially back on the schedule for 2009. For the first time in years, 2009 looks like the year when the PSP will finally overwhelm players with great games. But at that same E3, Kaz Hirai announces this.
So it's my pleasure today to officially introduce the next step in the evolution of the PlayStation Portable. For those who live a more digital lifestyle, who are downloading content across the network, who no longer need or desire tangible media like UMDs, CDs, or DVDs in their homes or backpacks or in their briefcases. And I have it right here in my pocket. Here it is.
A radically different design with a sliding system that reveals the buttons. Unfortunately for Sony, the PSP Go had leaked a few days earlier by mistake before being quickly taken down, but it was too late. The surprise effect was completely ruined. The PSP Go does not receive the ovation it might have had, and beyond that there is shock. There is no UMD drive. From now on, games must be purchased digitally from the PlayStation Store. At that moment, very few games are available digitally on the store, at a higher price than boxed copies at retail. No second-hand market, no budget titles with the best of platinum games at $10. The PSP already has a strong reputation as a console lacking major games. And just as big titles finally seem to be arriving, Sony announces a console that can only play a tiny fraction of them. And to make matters worse, journalists who try the PSP Go at the show complain about a smaller screen and serious ergonomic issues. Alongside this, Sony announces a platform for non-gaming applications: translators, interactive maps, online services, educational apps. In short, Sony tries to reshape the PlayStation Store into something closer to Apple's App Store in an attempt to fight smartphones, which are now clearly overshadowing the PSP. A little bit later, Sony announces its equivalent to DSiWare called Minis. Small downloadable games under 100 megabytes, sold at low prices on the PlayStation Store. Once again, the announcement struggles to convince because it comes far too late. Meanwhile, on the DS, Dragon Quest launches in Japan as a DS exclusive. It sells 2.3 million copies in its first week alone. To put that into perspective, the best-selling game of the previous year was Monster Hunter 2nd G, which sold 2.4 million units total since launch. Dragon Quest matches that in a single week. Unsurprisingly, DS sales reach new heights in Japan, in the one market where the PSP still seemed to have a chance. Sony sees the PSP Go as its last opportunity to get back into the race. The company announces multiple launch colors, numerous bundles, and Sony even promises 3 free games for players upgrading from a PSP to a PSP Go. But right before launch, Nintendo does it again. A press release quietly appears on Nintendo's website. Nintendo announces the DSi XL. With much larger screens, improved comfort at the cost of reduced portability. The surprise announcement spreads at lightning speed. Curiosity and anticipation explode, especially as the console is announced for November 2009 in Japan and March 2010 elsewhere. In October 2009, the PSP Go finally launches, and the disaster everyone feared becomes reality. It is a catastrophe, with anecdotal sales figures making it one of the worst console launches in history, while the PSP 3000 continues to sell far better. Now, to be fair, the PSP Go was never meant to replace the PSP 3000. Sony even cut the price of the PSP 3000 just before the PSP Go launched, making it nearly half the price. The PSP Go was designed to compete with smartphones. $250 is expensive compared to a PSP, but far cheaper than smartphones at the time. Sony heavily emphasizes Skype integration, allowing calls and messaging, with Skype being extremely popular at the time. The problem is that this concept is extremely hard to explain to the public. The average consumer does not see the PSP Go as a smartphone-like product. And the worst part is this: Gran Turismo PSP, delayed for years, is bundled with the PSP Go almost everywhere. But the game is poorly received by critics, with scores far below series standards, 6.8 at IGN, 4 at GameShark. Other strong PSP titles released that year suffer from the embarrassment of the PSP Go's launch. Most worrying of all, despite a new model, PSP sales are collapsing. Globally, quarterly sales fall from 5.1 million to 4.2 million. Sony failed to clearly communicate that the PSP Go was not meant to replace the PSP 3000, but to complement it. As a result, the failure of the PSP Go drags down overall PSP sales. Meanwhile, the DSi XL launches, and it boosts sales of a console that was starting to struggle with market saturation. It renews interest by encouraging early DS owners to upgrade to a more comfortable model. The fate of the PSP already seems sealed, but its end of life is going to be far more enigmatic. The year 2010 begins, and in Japan, driven by Kingdom Hearts and God Eater, the PSP manages to stand its ground against the DS and even overtakes it over the course of the year. In its home country, the PSP seems immortal. Unfortunately, outside Japan, the same story repeats itself. The DS is simply too strong. A new DS model launches outside Japan, an avalanche of games arrives, and the DS overwhelmingly dominates the PSP in Europe and the United States throughout the first half of the year. In the United States, sales fall to just 60,000 units in a single month, the lowest total since the console's launch. Sony relaunches aggressive offers for the system. Promotions appear where Sony offers up to 10 free games with the purchase of a PSP Go. A large wave of price cuts brings many games down to $10. Sony also announces that around 70 titles are scheduled to launch on PSP by December 2010, an average of 2 to 3 games per week. But these desperate measures have little impact. At E3, the PSP presence is almost non-existent. Sony barely mentions it. The feeling is unmistakable. The console is reaching the end of its life. In terms of high-quality games on the PSP, 2010 resembles 2008. Even the new God of War is not as well received as previous entries. Only Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker earns widespread critical acclaim, alongside Persona 3, a series still relatively unknown outside Japan at the time. What truly defines the end of 2010, however, is the constant stream of rumors surrounding a new Sony handheld. A PSP 2 is mentioned regularly, with fresh rumors almost every month. At the same time, rumors intensify around a PlayStation phone. Sony has a mobile subsidiary, Sony Ericsson, and speculation grows around a phone capable of playing PSP games. These rumors seem increasingly credible, with leaked photos and detailed technical information circulating online. Then on December 1, 2010, Monster Hunter Portable 3rd launches in Japan. PSP sales surge, benefiting from its very affordable price. The console rides the phenomenon all the way to becoming the best-selling console of the year in Japan. Massive promotions, new colors, new bundles, collector's editions. 2010 becomes the swan song of a truly unique console. 2011 begins with a bombshell.
Experience will be like.
On January 27th, at the PlayStation Meeting 2011, Sony announces the PS Vita, a new handheld console set to succeed the PSP, a powerhouse, an OLED screen, touchscreens, and crucially, several games are already announced, including Uncharted, Resistance, Wipeout, and Little Big Planet. Shortly afterward, Sony officially unveils the long-rumored PlayStation phone, the Xperia Play. It features a sliding design with physical controls and is far more gaming-focused than other smartphones, with a dedicated store called PlayStation Pocket and games optimized for mobile play. But it cannot run PSP games as the rumors suggested. Only a handful of adapted titles are available. If you barely remember this phone or never heard of it at all, there is a reason. It is a massive failure. The entire PlayStation-certified initiative, meant to introduce a range of gaming-optimized smartphones, quickly fades into obscurity. Soon after, production of the PSP Go is discontinued. It will have lasted barely a year and a half on the market, an extremely short lifespan. Then the Nintendo 3DS launches in Japan and almost simultaneously worldwide. Fortunately, the 3DS struggles at launch, and once again, a console rises from the dead to overtake it in Japan. That console is the PSP. Even as Sony heavily promotes its successor, the PS Vita, the PSP continues to benefit from astonishing longevity. To further counter the 3DS and attract new users, Sony announces the PSP Street, the fifth PSP model in just 6.5 years. A stripped-down version without Wi-Fi, with lower quality sound, sold for just $99, alongside yet more bundles. The PSP maintains solid sales in Japan and even sees a small revival elsewhere, continuing to sell steadily. Taking advantage of the difficult early years of the 3DS, the PSP, released back in 2004, continues to sell millions of units annually. Its advanced technology for the time allows it to age better than the DS. At the end of 2011, the PS Vita launches in Japan. The start is disastrous, and just as the PlayStation 2 once did during the early days of the PlayStation 3, the PSP absorbs a portion of disappointed users. In 2012, 8 years after its launch, the PSP still ranks among the best-selling consoles of the year. In Japan, it even outsells the PS Vita. Then in 2013, Sony stops reporting PSP sales in its financial results. Production ends shortly afterward. This time, it is truly over. Nearly a decade after its release, the PlayStation Portable takes its final bow. The PlayStation Portable occupies a truly unique place in video game history. It is a console that is often difficult to classify when it comes to its impact, its roller coaster sales figures, and the image it left behind. And it always raises the same question: was the PSP a failure? Is it hard to call the PSP a failure when it sold almost as well as the Game Boy Advance, even though it stayed on the market nearly twice as long? More than 80 million units were produced, but slightly fewer actually sold, closer to 78 million according to NPD and Media Create. That is still an enormous number. The PSP is the best-selling non-Nintendo handheld console in history, far ahead of others like the Game Gear, the Lynx, the Wonder Swan, and many more. The PlayStation Portable undeniably had a significant impact on the video game industry. And yet, if we are honest, the PSP is a failure, not because it sold poorly, but because it failed to meet Sony's own ambitions. Sony wanted to turn the PSP into the Walkman of the 21st century. They truly believed the PlayStation Portable would become a cultural phenomenon even bigger than their home consoles because handhelds reach a broader audience. They were convinced the PSP would crush the DS in terms of popularity. We heard their confidence loud and clear, Ken Kutaragi presenting the PSP in Japan by opening with the history of the Game Boy, as if passing the torch. Phil Harrison saying the DS did not even appear in Sony's plans. Kaz Hirai stating that the DS could launch before the PSP, after it, or at the same time, and it would change nothing, because Sony consoles had always crushed Nintendo consoles in the past. None of that happened. A product must always be judged against the goals of its manufacturer, especially considering the investments involved. And in that regard, the verdict is clear. Sony invested massively in the PSP. 5 models in just 6.5 years. That is extraordinary. Sony sold the console at a loss for years, at a very low price compared to its production cost, which represented a huge final commitment and contributed to putting Sony in the red for a time. They poured money into global marketing campaigns, celebrity partnerships, and long-term promotion in every region where the PSP launched. But the biggest bet Sony lost was the multimedia dream. The UMD format was a major failure. UMD movies never took off because sales were extremely weak, and the royalties from UMD video sales were supposed to help offset the massive losses caused by selling the PSP at such a low price. So the PSP is not a catastrophic failure, it is a relative failure. The real question is, how did Sony, at the height of its dominance, with the PlayStation 2 absolutely crushing the competition, with a brand image associated with cool, mature games, and an older audience, fail to turn the PSP into the cultural phenomenon it expected? The answer is simple. Sony made too many mistakes that revealed a lack of experience in the handheld market. First, the classic mistakes. A handheld priced at $250 outside Japan is simply too expensive for a device that cannot offer the same comfort as a home console. The Nintendo 3DS would later make the same mistake, launching at $250 and quickly dropping the price. Players simply do not accept paying more than around $200 for a handheld. It has almost never worked. Even the Switch Lite sits around that price. Another classic mistake is battery life. Today with smartphones, we are used to charging devices constantly, but at the time of the PSP's launch, 3.5 hours of gameplay was extremely weak, far too weak for a handheld console. Even before release, and while Sony avoided communicating clearly about battery life, the PSP already had a reputation as a device that needed to be recharged all the time. Reggie Fils-Aimé never stopped pointing this out because he understood how important battery life is to consumers. Then there was the accessories. Sony's proprietary memory stick, which was expensive. The protective case, which felt almost mandatory because the PSP looked fragile. All of this gave the console a sense of being overpriced, even borderline exploitative. And once again, Nintendo used this directly in its DS marketing. But beyond these classic issues, Sony made 3 major mistakes that ultimately sealed the PSP's fate. The first was failing to clearly define its audience at launch. No one really knew who the PSP was for. Was it a portable DVD player? A multimedia device? A gaming console? Parents were hesitant because of its fragility and mature design. Hardcore players were not convinced either, because they already owned a PlayStation 2, and later a PlayStation 3 or an Xbox 360. They preferred to play their favorite games in the best possible conditions, rather than pay $250 for a handheld. To create a cultural phenomenon, you must first win over a clear core audience, then expand outward. Sony failed to secure that initial audience, unlike with the PS1 and PS2. The second major mistake was loading times. To save battery life, the UMD drive was designed to spin up, load data, stop, then spin up again. This meant games had to load large chunks of data frequently. The result was long, frequent loading screens, sometimes lasting several minutes. That is already a problem on a home console. On a handheld, designed to fill short moments of free time, it is devastating. Combined with weak battery life, the PSP simply was not well suited to real-world portable use. And the third and most critical mistake was the lack of a steady flow of great games. This was the foundation of Sony's success with the PlayStation and PlayStation 2. Constant, major releases, a strong installed base attracting third-party publishers, a virtuous cycle of great games. With the PSP, that never happened. Many good games existed, often adaptations from PS1 and PS2, but they were not compelling enough. Most of its catalog was made up of spin-offs. The GTA games released on PSP were spin-offs, one of them even launching first on the DS. The same goes for Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, God of War Chains of Olympus, Gran Turismo PSP, which was widely seen as a stripped-down version of Gran Turismo 4 due to its missing features. The same for Metal Gear Solid, which first arrived with Metal Gear Acid, a pure spin-off, followed by Portable Ops and Peace Walker, both described by Kojima himself as narrative extensions of the saga rather than core entries. Even games that were supposed to be original, like Ratchet & Clank Size Matters, were criticized by the press for being almost carbon copies of the PlayStation 2 entries, and they were later released on PS2 anyway. It is extremely difficult to trigger the impulse purchases necessary to sell an expensive handheld console when there are almost no games that feel truly unmissable. And all the while, Nintendo was flooding its console with real blockbuster games, sequels to its flagship franchises, original titles, and true exclusives. This lack of original games is directly tied to the console's technical ambitions. The PSP was so powerful that developing games for it required teams almost as large as PS2 teams. The same development time, the same financial investment, all of that for a handheld game that would inevitably generate less revenue than a home console title due to lower price points, piracy, and more limited distribution. As a result, third-party publishers saw little incentive to invest heavily. Edge reported as early as June 2004, 6 months before the launch of both the PSP and the DS, that Japanese studios had already chosen the DS because it was simply more financially viable for them. And this was at a time when everyone believed the PSP would obliterate the DS, when the PSP was described everywhere as unstoppable. Sony also did not expect Nintendo to launch its console so early. That is why my documentary on the Game Boy Advance is titled Chronicle of a Sacrificed Console. The Game Boy Advance could have gone far beyond its 80 million units in just 3.5 years, but it was deliberately sacrificed by Nintendo to prevent Sony from launching the PSP under ideal conditions. Sony expected to launch the PSP against a dying Game Boy Advance. Instead, it quickly turned into a duel against the DS, and Nintendo built a profitable ecosystem for third-party publishers on the DS very early on. We will go deeper into that in the documentary on the Nintendo DS, but Nintendo carefully analyzed Sony's model and exploited its weaknesses. At the same time, Nintendo struck directly at Sony's biggest weakness. At that time, Sony owned very few exclusive franchises and developed or published relatively few games internally. As a result, they quickly found themselves without enough games to attract players to the platform. Then there was the PlayStation 3, which clearly handicapped the PSP. There was also the brutal rise of smartphones, which completely erased the PSP's multimedia advantage. And that is where it becomes truly impressive. Despite all these mistakes, despite all these problems, despite this image of a console lacking games, despite being more expensive than its competitors, despite ferocious competition, despite all of that, the PSP reached very high sales figures, and it still delivered genuinely interesting games. That is what is astonishing about the PSP, and it says a lot about the quality of the product itself. Yes, Sony made many mistakes, but as a product, the PSP was incredible. Just the idea of offering a portable console not far from a PlayStation 2 in 2004 is insane. And to that, its multimedia features, MP4 playback, MP3 support, a web browser, years before the smartphone explosion, combined with a stunning design. It was breathtaking. The PSP felt like it came from the future. It was a high-quality product that absolutely could have become the Walkman of the 21st century. In the end, the PSP is the story of an excellent product, undermined by fierce competition and its manufacturer's inexperience in the handheld market. And despite all of that, it still managed to become a memorable console. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. Do not hesitate to like and share the video. It is what helps keep the channel alive. These videos take an enormous amount of work, but I enjoy making them so much. I hope you enjoy watching them just as much. Whenever I make videos this deep and detailed, I always feel like no one else will care about them except me. So it truly means a lot to see people watch them to the end and appreciate them. And if you have any suggestions to improve the videos, feel free to leave them in the comments. See you soon for the next video. Take care.